UN just stepped in and gave America a disturbing ultimatum. NFL athletes have basically been running the mainstream media with the talk of oppression and how they are forced to endure the horrid conditions of living in America as a black millionaire, demonizing our country with every knee bend. These entitled players scream social injustice while doing absolutely nothing to actually fix what is really wrong in the streets and neighborhoods that they claim to be so very concerned about. After months of these ridiculous NFL protests, the United Nations has decided to interject themselves back into our politics once again. This time, the sickening demand is being made for only the white people who live in the United States. For the time that Obama was in office, he helped the United Nations start establishing a stronger presence within American cities by allowing the UN to create and place global police force within our country. His plan was to give America's sovereignty away under the guise of an organization called the Strong Cities Network. This move was unconstitutional by any scope of the word, and it was highly criticized by patriotic groups. Our Constitution requires a treaty before allowing any foreign military presence to base itself on American soil, and that was not part of Obama's deal with the UN. Launched by the UN way back in September of 2015. The Strong Cities Network was intended to provide the first ever global network of mayors and municipal level policymakers with the stated goal of providing what they like to call a community to see out of violent extremism in all its forms. Translation: to try and begin the push for a one world government, or a new world order as some call it, with the United Nations' responsibility to protect doctrine, which is meant to be an enabling principle that would allow an international community to intervene whenever they assume they see anything that resembles crimes being committed against humanity. The UN would then be able to take it upon themselves to supposedly safeguard any citizen who they think is supposedly being racially discriminated against. To put it bluntly, the UN can now invade a country with a UN police force if they decide that any crimes against humanity have occurred. Now, in recent weeks, the United Nations Human Rights Commissioners feel that they have found alarming racism trends in America. To solve this farce of a problem, the UN is now threatening to intervene unless white Americans meet the demands and start paying reparations for slavery. Too bad that the majority of racist attacks are being perpetrated by black Americans against whites, and not the other way around. The Washington Post reports, the history of slavery in the United States justifies reparations for African Americans, argues a recent report by a UN-affiliated group based in Geneva. This conclusion was part of a study by the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, a body that reports to the International Organization's High Commissioner on Human Rights. The group of experts, which includes leading human rights lawyers from around the world, presented its findings to the United Nations Human Rights Council on Monday, pointing to the continuing link between present injustices and the dark chapters of American history. In particular, the legacy of colonial history, enslavement, racial subordination and segregation, racial terrorism and racial inequality in the United States remains a serious challenge, as there has been no real commitment to reparations and to truth and reconciliation for people of African descent, the report stated. Contemporary police killings of the trauma that they create are reminiscent of the past racial terror of lynching. Citing the past year's spate of police officers killing unarmed African American men, the panel warned against impunity for state violence, which has created, in its words, a human rights crisis that must be addressed as a matter of urgency. Despite substantial changes since the end of the enforcement of Jim Crow and the fight for civil rights, ideology ensuring the domination of one group over another continues to negatively impact the civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights of African Americans today, it said in a statement. The dangerous ideology of white supremacy inhibits social cohesion amongst the US population. The United Nations seems to now be taking up the ridiculous cause of the NFL athletes protesting while making the asinine claim that there's currently a human rights crisis that must be addressed. IGHA a matter of urgency. The question is, do they plan to address it by slapping a fine on anyone who happened to be born white? Or are they going to invade us with the police force and just start arresting white people? If the UN determines that crimes against humanity have occurred, regardless of the fact that it is an absolutely absurd thing to think in this day and age, how exactly do they plan to respond? This isn't even the first time recently that the United Nations has attempted to pull one of the power plays in our country. After the Charlottesville incident that was spurred into a chaotic and tragic mess by Antifa, KKK, and BLM, Anastasia Cricklick, chairwoman of UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, CERD, issued a warning to America on August 12th saying, "We are alarmed by the racist demonstrations, with overtly racist slogans, chants and salutes by white nationalists, neo-Nazis, and the Ku Klux Klan, promoting white supremacy and inciting racial discrimination and hatred," Cricklick said. In a decision issued under its early warning and urgent action procedure, the committee, which monitors implementation of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, stated there should be no place in the world for racist white supremacist ideas or any similar ideologies that reject the core human rights principles of human dignity and equality. She continued, in addition to the criminal investigation of the individual who plowed his car into a crowd of peaceful protesters killing a woman, the UN experts asked the US authorities to undertake concrete measures to address the root causes of the proliferation of such racist manifestations. This is quite concerning coming from the Sharia law supporting United Nations, since the same warning has only been issued in a handful of countries in the past 10 years where the UN warned third world areas such as Burundi, Iraq, Ivory Coast, Kyrgyzstan and Nigeria are their actions against humanity. Cricklick is now getting the UN to undertake concrete measures against the United States. This is not merely a power play statement, but also a huge insult coming from an organization as corrupt as the United Nations. To start attacking our very diverse country and publicly calling us out is not something the UN should even be attempting now that the palpitant chief is no longer here to help them. America has done far more over the years to work towards eradicating racism and to fight for the human rights of everyone than any other country ever has or ever will. Let's be real and keep in mind that the UN seems to be perfectly fine with Christians being massacred by ISIS, Muslims having forced sex slaves, wild genocide in Africa, and the horrifying treatment of women in most Middle Eastern countries. The very notion that any white people alive today should be forced to pay reparations for slavery that happened 200 years ago is absolutely ludicrous. How is it even remotely fair and just to demonize the entire white race when only 6% of Southerners even owned slaves? So white people will be forced to pay these reparations for slavery that had absolutely nothing to do with them. If the United Nations truly cared about the issues facing minorities, they would instead be raising hell over the crime statistics of minority-populated neighborhoods in this country. The FBI has even recently reported that 90% of blacks murdered were killed at the hands of other blacks. Yet as soon as there's several incidents of our police shooting armed criminals of color, there's suddenly a human rights crisis, and the United Nations feels that white America must atone for it. Is this really what it has come to in America? The criminals get to be martyrs while the white people have to pay for because of racism. Where did reality run off to?